The cold had already settled into the east side of the porch by the time I walked out that evening. The kind of cold that comes in off a frozen lake and finds the gaps in your jacket before you have taken 3 steps. I remember standing at the corner of the woodpile with a piece of split oak in each hand, not stacking it, just holding it, because something had gone quiet in the trees that I could not immediately account for. Pepper was sitting at my left boot, and she was not moving. Not the restless sitting she did when she smelled deer at the salt lick. The settled kind. The kind where a dog has already decided something and is waiting for you to catch up. I want to be precise about what I mean by quiet, because there is ordinary quiet, and there is that particular absence of sound that means the woods have arranged themselves around something. The chickadees that worked the hemlock line all afternoon were gone. The pair of newthatches that had been running the bark of the big red oak since mid-morning were gone. Even the wind had pulled back. What I heard instead was my own breathing, Pepper's slow exhale against my boot, and the faint creak of the cabin eave as the temperature dropped another degree or two. The sky over the ridge had gone the color of old tin, and the snow that had crusted the upper meadow that morning had taken on the bluish-cast snow takes on at dusk in a hard freeze, so that the whole property seemed lit from underneath rather than from above. I could smell the wood smoke from the stove drifting back along the eave, and beneath it the cleaner smell of fresh-cut oak from the splitting round, and beneath that the resinous smell of the spruces themselves, which carries in cold weather the way it does not carry in warm. And then, between the 2 largest spruce trees at the edge of the property, something was standing there that I did not have a category for. I've told this story twice. Once to Roy, roughly. Once to you, as complete as I can make it. To understand what I was looking at in that tree line, I need to go back to the week before Thanksgiving, and before that to the kind of spring that puts a man somewhere he never expected to be standing. Mavis died in late March. A short illness. The kind that moves faster than the doctors expect and faster than the family can reorganize around. She was 56 years old, and she had been the center of gravity in our house for 30 years. And when she was gone, the house in Warsaw felt like a building I had broken into, full of rooms that belonged to someone else. I remember sitting at the kitchen table the morning after the funeral with a cup of coffee I had not poured for myself in 2 decades, looking at the chair across from me, and not being able to make sense of how a chair so familiar could feel like furniture from someone else's life. The house had taken on a particular acoustic she would have recognized as wrong, because she was a person who noticed acoustics, the way a room sounds different with 1 person in it than with 2, and I sat in that wrongness for what must have been an hour before I could move. I went through the motions of the following weeks, the arrangements and the paperwork and the casseroles left on the porch by neighbors who did not know what else to offer, and neither did I. I said the right things at the right times. I went back to work on the line crew in April because I did not know what else to do with my hands. By June, I had put in my retirement. 31 years as a journeyman lineman for the co-op, and I walked out of the office on a Thursday afternoon with a handshake and a card signed by 17 people and nowhere particular to be. The plan, to the extent I had one, was to spend the summer dealing with the house, figuring out what to keep and what to let go of, and then decide something. I did not decide anything. The summer went by in the way summers do when you are moving through your days without much interest in what day it is. Mavis had a family cabin on 14 acres up near Drummond, in the northern part of the state. Her family had owned it since the 1950s, a 1-story frame building with a wood stove and a hand pump in the kitchen that we had mostly used in summers and the occasional deer season. When I found myself in October with no plan, and the Warsaw house feeling smaller and quieter every week, I made what I told myself was a practical decision. The cabin needed winterizing. The wood stove needed a new gasket. There was a length of soffit along the north wall that had been pulling loose since the previous spring. I loaded the truck with tools and 3 weeks' worth of groceries and Pepper's food and drove the 3 hours north on a Saturday. I told Roy I would be back before Christmas. He called me 3 times in the first week. He lived in Indianapolis now, had been there 6 years, working in logistics. We had not been easy with each other since Mavis died, or if I am being honest, since a year or 2 before that, the way a father and a son can drift into a silence that neither one decides on, but neither one corrects. When he called, I answered, but I did not say much beyond telling him the cabin was in decent shape, and the weather was manageable, and that Pepper seemed to like it. He said she always liked it up there. He was right, she had. Mavis had taken her up every August. I am not a person who believes in things I cannot explain. I want to be clear about that going in. 31 years on a line crew teaches you to read the physical world in terms of load and resistance, of what holds and what fails and why, and there is not a lot of tolerance in that work for impressions that cannot be verified. I measured twice and I cut once, and I expected the boards to be where I put them when I came back. That is who I was going into November in those woods. The first thing I noticed that I could not account for was Pepper's behavior at the tree line. It started around the 2nd week of November, after the first hard freeze had come through and locked up the ground. She had been alerting at the east tree line in the mornings, the soft directional alerting she used for deer, ears forward, chin level, not the raised hackle alert she used for coyotes, or the ones she had once used for a black bear that had come through the property 2 summers running. I walked the tree line that first morning and found nothing I could identify. The frost was unbroken past the first 20 feet into the timber. No deer prints, no sign of digging. I put it down to deer scent carrying on the cold air, the way it does in a hard freeze when the ground stops holding moisture and the smell travels differently. The second morning she did it again, and I stood at the tree line longer that time, maybe 10 minutes, watching the timber. Nothing moved. There was enough wind to account for scent transport, I told myself. Deer moved through that corridor between the property and the ridge to the northeast. I had seen the sign all fall. The explanation held for another 2 days. The third time, I walked the line and found something that gave me pause. In the soft earth along the edge of the property, where the frost had not fully penetrated because of the leaf litter and the spruce overhang, there were impressions in the ground. Large ones. Not the deep punched oval of a deer hoof. Something broader. Something that pressed flat rather than sinking to a point, and spaced in a stride I could not match to anything in the county that I was aware of. I crouched over the nearest one for a long time. I told myself it could be a large dog from one of the camps further up the ridge, or the impression of a deadfall log that had rolled through there sometime during a wet stretch, the bark compressing the earth as it went. Neither of those explanations entirely fit the shape of what I was looking at, but I was not ready to follow those impressions where they pointed, so I stood up and went back to splitting wood. I want to say something about splitting wood in that period, because it was the thing that kept me on a schedule when I did not have much use for one. I had gotten into the habit of rising around 5:30, putting the stove up, and going out to the woodpile before the light fully came on. The physical rhythm of it, the set of the maul, the reed of the grain, the way a piece of red oak splits differently from ash, all of that occupied my hands and enough of my mind that I did not have to manage the silence actively. I was getting through roughly 3 to 4 hours of splitting and stacking before the cold drove me inside, and I found that the hours after that were easier if I had worn myself out some beforehand. Mavis used to say that I was allergic to sitting still. She said it with affection, the way she said most things. I had not thought about it much while she was alive. I thought about it every afternoon that November. She had started feeding the winter birds the year we were married, which was 30 years before she died. It began with a simple wooden feeder she had nailed to a fence post outside the kitchen window in Warsaw. And it became, over those 30 years, a ritual she kept the way some people keep a garden or a journal. She knew the birds by species and behavior, knew when the juncos arrived in the fall and when the cardinals started coming to the platform feeder in January, knew which days the Nuthatch would skip the suet cake and go straight for the sunflower hearts. When we came up to the cabin in the summers, she brought seed with her and set out a small white enamel dish on a flat stump at the edge of the yard, about 10 inches across, and filled it every other day. The dish was still there when I arrived in October. I found it on the stump where she had left it the previous August, weathered and empty. I rinsed it out and set it back on the stump without thinking much about why, and I went into town the following Saturday, 11 miles on a county road, and bought a 5-pound bag of sunflower hearts from the hardware store, because it seemed like the thing to do. I put seed in the dish every other day the way she had. I did not look too closely at the fact that I was doing it. It was something to do in the mornings before the splitting. Something small and deliberate that the day could be organized around. The chickadees found it within the first week, and then the nuthatches, and then a pair of hairy woodpeckers that I had not expected, and I watched them from the kitchen window while I drank my coffee and felt, in some incomplete way I could not articulate, like something was being kept alive that I did not know how to keep alive on my own. If you have ever maintained a habit that belonged to someone who is gone, you know the particular mix of comfort and guilt that comes with it. Like you were borrowing something you were not left the deed to. I kept doing it anyway. Pepper's alerting at the tree line continued through the second week of November. I upgraded my explanation from deer scent to coyotes working the ridge, which at least accounted for the spacing of whatever I had found in the soft ground near the tree line. Coyotes will run in a loose pack in a hard winter, and a big male can cover ground in a stride that looks wrong if you are expecting a deer. I held that explanation for 3 days, and then I went back to the impressions one morning and measured the stride against my own, heel to toe, at a full pace. And the math did not work. A coyote big enough to leave those impressions would need to weigh something the county did not produce. I stopped trying to account for the impressions after that. I did not stop noticing them. The cordwood appeared on a Thursday. I had split and stacked what I thought was my last run before the snow came in, and when I came out the following morning there was a neat bundle of split lengths stacked against the barn door that I had not put there. Roughly 24 pieces, split clean from what looked like a mix of red oak and ash, stacked in the overlapping cross pattern I had been using for the woodpile. The cuts were not mine. The saw had worked differently. The grain split on a slightly different angle than the way I set a piece, and the pieces were longer by a couple of inches than what I had been cutting to fit the stovebox. I stood at that barn door for a long time. I went through the available explanations methodically, the way I would have gone through a wiring fault on a distribution line, starting with the most likely and working toward the least. Someone from the neighboring camp had left wood at the wrong property by mistake. A logging crew had been working the ridge, and someone had dumped a load clearing their saw truck. The county ran a winterization program for unoccupied properties, and someone had made an error about which cabin was occupied and which was not. I spent 2 days on those explanations. I called the county extension office from my cell phone, standing in the one spot on the property where I got a reliable signal, leaning against the northeast corner of the cabin with the phone at my ear, while the woman in the office told me they did not run any such program in that area. I drove to the neighboring camp, which was owned by a man from Ashland who used it for bow season and was not there in November. I left a note on his door. He called me 4 days later. He had not been up to the property since mid-October, and he had not sent anyone. I came back from that call and stood looking at the stacked wood for another good while. The pieces had settled with the weather, the way fresh split wood does, tightening against each other as the temperature cycled. They had been there long enough to have done that. I restacked 2 of the pieces to check the cut ends, and the grain was clean and dry. Not green wood, not recently felled. Whoever had split it from seasoned timber, the way you do when you know what you are doing, not from standing wood. I carried the pieces into the barn and stacked them with the rest of my wood, and I did not tell anyone about them. There was no one to tell that would have made the conversation comfortable. That weekend, I went back to the bird dish. The dish had been filled, not with sunflower hearts, with pine cones, 3 small ones placed in the center, and a scatter of dried berries around them, the dark kind that come off the winterberry shrubs along the creek bed. The arrangement was not random. The pine cones were placed upright in a rough triangle. The berries filled the space between them evenly, the way you might fill a dish if you were paying attention to how it looked. The snow that had come in overnight had dusted the rim of the dish the way it dusted everything else on the property, which meant whatever had arranged those materials had done it before the snow, sometime in the night or the very early morning before I came out. I sat down in the snow next to the stump. I did not plan to. My knees just went, and I sat there in the cold with my hand on the edge of the dish, and I looked at the arrangement for a long time. Mavis used to put pine cones in the dish in November. She said the birds liked picking the seeds from between the scales, that it gave them something to work at. She had shown me once, patient the way she was patient about everything she loved, pulling a scale back with her thumbnail to show me the papery seed underneath. I had not thought about that in 8 months. I thought about it now with a clarity that made the cold feel very far away. I could see her hand in the memory, the small scar across the second knuckle she had gotten from a kitchen knife the year Roy was born, and I could hear the laugh she gave when one of the seeds had stuck to her fingertip and she had had to flick it loose. Memory is not always merciful, but the memories that came up beside that dish were merciful in a way I had not been allowing myself to admit was possible. The breath went out of me slow, and the cold got into my coat, and I did not move. I want to be honest about what I felt sitting there in the snow with my hand on that dish. I did not feel frightened. I have thought about that since, tried to understand why I did not feel frightened, and the best answer I have arrived at is that whatever had filled that dish had not done it in a way that felt threatening. It felt like something I had earned, or been given, or both in some measure that I could not untangle. I sat there until my legs were stiff from the cold, and Pepper pressed her head against my arm, and that was what got me moving again. The encounter happened 3 days later, at dusk, near the East Woodpile. I had been out splitting since 3 in the afternoon, the light already going orange and flat by the time I was stacking the last run, and the chickadees that had been working the hemlock line all afternoon had gone quiet in that particular way I had learned to notice over the preceding weeks. Pepper had come out with me the way she always did, and she had set herself down at my left boot without being told, the calm settled kind of sitting, and I held the 2 pieces of oak in my hands, and I looked toward the tree line. Something was standing between the 2 largest spruce trees at the edge of the property. It was standing still. It was very large, 8 feet or more of it, visible above the brushy understory that ran between those spruces, and it was dark furred, in a way that read brown to me in that light, rather than black, though the dusk was already softening everything. It was standing upright. That registered first, before the scale of it, before anything else. Upright and still, the way a person stands when they have stopped moving and are simply occupying a space. I did not move. Pepper did not move. I was aware of my own breathing going shallow, not from fear exactly, but from the kind of full attention that does not leave room for anything else. It turned its head toward me. Not toward the cabin, not toward the dish on the stump, toward me, with a slowness that suggested nothing hurried. The eyes were dark, and they caught the last of the low light the way an animal's eyes will. That brief reflective quality. But what I noticed most was not the light in them, but the attention behind them. I was aware, standing there with the 2 pieces of oak in my hands, of the cold against my cheekbones, of the small ache in my right shoulder from the afternoon's splitting, of Pepper's slow, steady breathing at my boot, and of the way the whole property had taken a step inward in some way I cannot describe, except to say that the air had a held quality, the way a held breath has a held quality, and that the holding included me. I had spent my working life reading what things were doing and why, reading line wire under load, reading weather on a pole 40 feet up, and what I read in those eyes was attention the way you recognize it in another person when they are really there with you, not looking past you, not through you, at you. I have been looking for the right word for what that felt like for 2.5 months now. I have not found it. We stood like that for what felt like a long time, though I know from the change in light that it could not have been more than a few minutes. The cold was doing what cold does at dusk in northern Wisconsin in late November, and the air between me and those trees had gone very still. Pepper did not bark. She did not whine. She sat at my boot, and she breathed, and that steadied me more than anything I could have done for myself. Then the shape moved, not toward me, but toward the stump where the dish sat, slowly, in a way that covered the distance without urgency, more like a deliberate crossing of a room than a movement in the wild. It crouched at the stump or lowered itself, and I saw one large hand come out and settle on the rim of the dish, the fingers closing gently over the enamel edge, the way you would cup something fragile. It held that position for a moment. Then it set something in the dish, a gesture so ordinary and so specific that my chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I could not see clearly what it placed there in the last of that light, but in the morning, when I went to the dish before the coffee was done, there were more winterberries in it, arranged the way I had found them before, and in the center this time, balanced on the rim at a slight angle, a single dried stem of goldenrod, the seed head still mostly intact. The kind of thing Mavis used to press in a book and pull out in January to remind herself that summer had been real. I stood at that dish in the morning cold, and I understood, without being able to explain the mechanism of understanding, that whatever had been moving in those woods around me for the preceding 3 weeks had paid attention to something I did not know how to carry alone. The guilt I had been packing around since late March, the specific guilt of still being here when she was not, of continuing her habits without her, of waking up each morning and not knowing what the point of the day was. Not because I lacked things to do, but because she was the person I had been doing things toward for 30 years. That weight shifted in me standing at that dish in the cold. It did not lift entirely. But it shifted, the way a load does when you re-rig the balance point, and I found I could breathe against it differently. I went back to the tree line in the grey morning light and stood at the edge of the timber for a while, listening. No impressions in the overnight frost that I could find in the narrow strip of sheltered earth along the spruce line. The woods were doing what they normally did, a pair of chickadees working the hemlock again, a newthach running a birch trunk 20 yards in. Whatever had stood at those spruces the previous evening had moved on, in the night or early morning, in the direction of the ridge. I walked the fence line out of habit, which took me past the barn, and I put my hand on the stacked cordwood for a moment, the fresh pale pieces in among the weathered ones. Then I went inside and I stood at the counter for a long time before I picked up my phone. Roy answered on the second ring. I had not called him, he had always called me, and the 2 rings before he picked up were long enough that I almost put the phone down twice. The kitchen was still warm from the morning fire, and I could smell the coffee I had let go cold on the counter, and beneath that the faint smell of the cedar shavings I had used to start the stove 3 hours earlier, and all of those familiar things, felt suddenly like the kind of small reassurance you accept gratefully when you are about to do something hard. Dad. He sounded like he was trying to be careful. Hey. I did not have a structure for what I wanted to say. I knew I wanted to say something, and I did not have the architecture for it. I've been meaning to call. I know. He waited. He had learned to wait for me from Mavis. I'm all right up here, I said, which was not exactly what I meant. I've been thinking about coming back around Christmas, driving down to see you if there's room. There was a pause that went on long enough that I started to reconstruct what I had said, to check whether I had said the wrong thing. Yeah, Dad. His voice was different in those two words. Something in it that had not been there in the fall. Yeah, there's room. We talked for 22 minutes. Not about the woods, not about what I had seen or what had been left in the dish, or what I had understood standing in the cold that morning. I did not have language for any of that yet, and I was not sure I ever would. We talked about the drive down, about whether I should bring Pepper or board her, about what he and his girlfriend were doing for the holiday. It was the most ordinary conversation I had managed in 8 months. When I hung up, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dish on the stump. A Junco had found the Winterbreeze and was working through them with that precise mechanical action Juncos have, the quick side-to-side sorting. I watched it for a while. Then I poured my coffee, and I drank it at the table instead of the counter, which was the first time I had done that since I arrived. The weeks between that phone call and Christmas were not easy. I do not want to suggest the weight went away entirely, because it did not, and I would not trust a story that said it did. The cabin was still quiet in the particular way that an empty place is quiet when you have known it as a full one. Mavis's family photographs were on the wall above the wood stove, 3 generations of summers at that property, and I looked at them every morning when I fed the stove, and most mornings that looking cost me something. I kept putting seed in the dish. The birds kept coming. But something in the distribution of the weight had changed, the way I said. I split the wood because I needed wood, and because the rhythm of it suited me, and not only because I needed something to do with my hands at 5:30 in the morning, to avoid sitting still. Those are different things. The difference may sound small, but it was not small. I drove down to Indianapolis for 3 days over Christmas. Pepper rode in the back seat the way she always had, her chin on the console between me and the empty passenger seat. The drive was 11 hours with stops. Roy and his girlfriend made up the spare room and put a dog bed in the corner for Pepper, and the 3 of us ate at a table that was loud in the way tables are when people are trying, and it is working. Roy and I did not talk about his mother directly, not that visit. We talked around her the way you do when you are both still finding the shape of things. That was enough for then. I was back at the cabin before New Year's. The temperature had dropped to single digits while I was gone, and the wood stove had gone cold, which meant 3 hours of work getting the place back to livable. The dish on the stump had an inch of snow in it, which I cleared, and I put fresh seed in it even though the birds would not likely find it until the temperature moderated. I did it because it was the thing to do. That was reason enough. The days in January were short, and the work was the work of a cold season, tending the stove, keeping the pipes from freezing in the crawl space, splitting the last of the seasoned oak into manageable pieces for the box. I found myself spending an hour or 2 in the evenings reading, which I had not done with any regularity in years. Mavis had been the reader in the household. I had always meant to get back to it. I was getting back to it. I did not see anything at the tree line again. I looked, in the mornings when I walked the fence line, and in the evenings at dusk when I was stacking the last wood. The woods did what the woods do in deep winter, which is conduct their business at a scale and in a register that a man standing at the property line cannot fully read. I accepted that. I am not going to tell you that I know what was out there. I spent 31 years as a working lineman, and I have no framework for it that I trust. What I know is what I observed, in the order I observed it, by a man who has spent his working life being precise about what he sees and what he cannot account for. And I have told you those things as accurately as I am capable of. The rest is what it is. There is an old man named Harlan who retired from the DNRI years ago and drinks his coffee at the same diner in town every weekday morning, 11 miles down the county road. I stopped in there in January on a hardware run and sat at the counter and drank a cup across from him. I did not tell him what I had seen, but I asked him in a general way what kind of animals move through the ridge country in November. He gave me the standard answer: deer, coyote, occasional black bear before the denning, the usual mix. I said I had seen some impressions I could not account for, and he looked at me over his cup for a moment in the way that a man looks at you when he is deciding something. Things move through those ridges, he said, that the county does not have a name for. He did not elaborate. I did not ask him to. We sat with that for a minute, and then he asked me how the cabin was holding up in the cold, and I told him, and that was the rest of the conversation. I'm not a person who tells a story like this expecting to be believed. I understood when I started telling it that belief was not something I could ask for or produce on demand. What I can do is be accurate about what happened, the sequence and the specific detail, and let the listener weigh it. If you have had a moment like this, or something that points at the same territory from a different angle, I imagine you know what I mean when I say that the weight of evidence and the question of what to do with it can occupy you for a long time in a quiet season. I stayed at the cabin through February. I had thought I might leave in January, but the thought of the Wayoso house was not something I was ready for, and the cabin had begun to feel less like somewhere I was hiding and more like somewhere I was living, which is a distinction that matters even if it is hard to account for. Roy called every week or so. Sometimes I called him. We were working on a new language between us, one that did not have all the words yet, but had enough of them to carry the conversation forward. He asked, in February, whether he and his girlfriend might come up to the cabin in the spring when the weather turned. I told him the cabin would be open. The dish is still on the stump. I fill it every other day with sunflower hearts, and in the mornings I check what the birds have made of it. Juncos and chickadees mostly through February, and a pair of redpolls that came through once and then were gone. I have not put pine cones in it. I have not put winterberries in it. Those were not mine to arrange. On a morning near the end of February, I came out before full light to feed the stove from the porch box, and Pepper walked out behind me and sat down on the top porch step and pointed her nose toward the east tree line in the calm, settled way she had developed in November. Not the deer alert, not the coyote alert. The other one. The one I had come to read as meaning she knew something was there and had already decided it was all right. I stood on the porch with a piece of split oak in each hand, and I looked toward the timber. The light was just beginning to come, that particular blue-grey that comes before the sun clears the ridge, and the spruce trees at the property edge were still mostly shapes against a slightly lighter sky. I could not see anything distinct in those shapes. I did not need to. Pepper settled herself more firmly onto the step, the way she does when she is planning to stay a while, and I set the wood on the porch rail and stood there with her until the light came on enough to see the yard. The dish was where it always was. The goldenrod stem was gone, had been gone since the first hard wind in December. The dish was just the dish, white enamel on a flat stump at the edge of the yard, holding sunflower hearts in a thin January frost. Some things do not need to be explained to do their work.